Silence, please. All rise.
Thank you. Please sit down. Now, Mr. Black, I think we turn to you next.
I'm not going to get an answer to my
Oh,
question.
I'm sorry.
Just
Yes, we can't have your
Yes.
question not answered.
That's fine. Now, forgive me, Commissioner, it was basically to do with why is the government...
Why is small business
Yeah.
better able to manage a 2.7% increase in wages than government with some assumptions built in terms of signalling?
Yeah. I think in that regard, I mean, the first thing I'd probably say is that they're two very different groups of people. So in that regard, the public sector employees in WA are amongst the best paid in Australia. Many of the occupational groups are the best paid. So generally speaking, they're much higher income earners, whereas the low paid, the people affected by the state wage order are on or not too far above the minimum wage.
But not according to the signalling arguments that we get, both as a plus here and a minus from the CCI, that it's going to flow through because someone on a higher pay, if someone on minimum wage gets 2.5, someone with skills and experience and qualifications is not going to settle for 2.2. You want 2.7, I'm more valuable to you.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose in that regard, the Minister's submission hasn't been developed on the grounds of specifically for a signalling purpose or for or to boost aggregate demand per se. It's focused more on the needs of the low paid and
Well, I could accept that if there wasn't pages and pages in your submission about the economy.
yeah, oh sure, and that's something that we do every year, and that's something that the Commission requests. But I mean, in that regard, it's the Minister's focusing on the objectives of the 50A objectives in the Industrial Relations Act, which really talk quite a bit about the needs of low paid and fair system of wages and conditions of employment, improving living standards, that type of thing. The groups in government, I guess affected by government wages policy and what have you, are generally speaking much higher paid, and so they're they're in a different category, if you like. They're not affected by the state wage order.
So are you saying to me that flow-on is a myth?
How do you mean, like, in terms of the...
Well, if you say that people at higher wages will not be affected by a decision we make, inherent in that is that flow-on must be a myth. That is, it doesn't flow on to people with higher wages.
We'd say that people on higher wages are generally... their wages are determined through different mechanisms. So it's right to say that probably there isn't a great deal of flow-on from the state wage order through to high income earners in Western Australia.
I'm just working on, when I say higher, I mean higher than $36,000, because it's at that point that $1,000 is a 2.7% increase. Anyone higher than that, it's less than 2.7.
That's right.
So for anyone higher than that, you're saying business can afford to pay 2.7 to them, but government can't. I'm saying, why are you saying that?
We're saying government, the average... It's not that government can't. Government's made a deliberate budget.
Why won't government do it then? If you're expecting small business to do it.
With respect, the state wage case is all about the employees remaining in the state jurisdiction, which for the most part happen to be small business. Most of the public sector isn't affected by the state wage order. So the Minister's position is focused on those people who are covered by the state wage order. It's not specifically designed with signalling or that in mind. They're two different policies and processes, I guess. That's...
Mr. Black. Sorry, Chair, I didn't mean to take over, but if that's the answer, then...
Thank you. Mr. Black.
Thank you, Chief Commissioner. The Commission Court pleases, CCI relies on submission in reply in relation to this matter. Today we'd just like to talk more broadly, and as we are all very well aware, WA has been experiencing a protracted period of challenging economic conditions since the end of the resources investment boom over 4 years ago. The difficult times facing the state were particularly acute in 2016-17. As we have seen, gross state product fell by 2.7% to end a 26-year run of growth, and state final demand fell by 7.2%. There is no doubt that confidence has emerged in WA over the latter part of 2017 and this has continued into 2018. CCI WA's quarterly surveys of business and consumer confidence reflect this. The March 2018 survey of business confidence showed that WA businesses are increasingly confident of the economy's prospects and are expecting economic conditions to improve over the next 12 months. 63% of businesses see those conditions getting stronger. Only 7% believe that the economy will worsen. On a similar note, the March 2018 survey of consumer confidence showed a growing belief in WA's economy, with the consumer confidence growing to its highest level in 4 years. Short-term confidence, however, remains subdued, but over the coming year, 34% of consumers think that the economy will improve, while only 24% think it will worsen. However, at the end of the day, we must recognise that confidence is only a sentiment. It is a fragile thing, and that can be easily shattered.
It's also coming off a low base, isn't it, Mr. Black?
Indeed. We would therefore say that this newfound confidence requires nurturing over the near term to actually convert it into practical outcomes for the benefit of everyone. The recent state budget for 2018-19 also reflects a return of confidence. However, the budget also confirms that the continuing challenges will remain through 2018-19 before a slow improvement to a more positive position from 2019-20 and beyond. As the state government noted in its budget papers, state final demand for the domestic economy is yet to trough and is expected to contract for a fifth consecutive year in 2017-18 and decline again, though only marginally, in 18-19. The domestic economy is not forecast to be positive until 2019-20. Particularly the budget and the presentation from Mr Christmas this morning shows that business investment will decline by another 14% in 2018-19 before returning to positive territory in 2019-20. CPI is forecast to remain at or below 2% until 2020-21. The wage price index will continue to outpace CPI through the forward estimates. Population growth is forecast to remain modest to 2019-20. Growth in working age population will remain low until 2019-20. The unemployment rate will remain at or exceed 5.5% until 2021, with the government acknowledging only modest falls in labour market spare capacity. And employment growth is forecast to strengthen by 2020-21. In citing the strengthening of employment growth by 2021, the government notes that this will coincide with a recovery in the domestic economy. Clearly, the government sees that we still have some way to go before we can confirm that recovery. Government has said that the 2018-19 budget was about creating jobs, and we agree that creating jobs is central to recovery. And so we say that this can only be done with a strong, viable and sustainable small business community. The state is only beginning the progression from the malaise it has been in for a considerable period, and that will potentially appear in 2019-20. The return to positive growth will be at a slow and gradual pace. While we can look forward with some degree of confidence that things are getting better and take some comfort, even relief, from all the positive indicators and projections, we must deal with the here and now and the reality of the year in front. We must focus on the short term and the current, not become enamoured with the projected outlook. 2018-19 will still be challenging, and again we say that this confidence must be nurtured to deliver real and sustainable results. While we can feel better, optimism must be coupled with responsibility and caution, and recovery just won't happen. We must also acknowledge that we continue to remain exposed to the vagaries and influences of the global market for growth. There are significant external factors that influence the state of performance. So we must continue to look to the essential grassroots of our economy and our communities for the role they can play to materialise the confidence that we see emerging. It is what we do now that will influence the successful delivery of that confidence to achieve what both businesses and individuals are looking for. We would first likely just to broadly address the labour market. In March this year, unemployment reached a 16-year high at 6.9%. In April, that fell to 6.5%. It remains almost 1 percentage point higher than the national unemployment rate. WA's unemployment rate on a seasonally adjusted basis was 6.2% through the 2016-17 financial year. The current financial year unemployment rate from July 17 to April 18 is 6.05%. Unemployment is unacceptably high. Youth unemployment is a particularly acute and concerning challenge. WA's youth unemployment rate has steadily increased since January 2015 and reached a 22-year high in March this year at 17.1%. In April, that rate fell also to 16%. The national youth unemployment rate in April was 12.5%. WA's average youth unemployment rate over the last 3 months is 16.6%. Our employees of the future are finding it difficult to enter the workforce. Youth unemployment remains unacceptably and persistently high, and it is crucial for the future to encourage employment opportunities for 15 to 24-year-olds. Youth must be provided with pathways to employment, and it is important that every avenue is made available and accessible to encourage entry-level opportunities for youth. WA must avoid the build-up of a large pool of youth at risk of becoming long-term unemployed, and integral to this is the care required to avoid pricing youth out of entry-level jobs. Businesses also need to be encouraged to provide opportunities for labour market entrants, not imposed with limitations. One critical source is the availability of apprenticeship and traineeship opportunities to enable entry to the labour market and a pathway to higher paid jobs. Apprentices and trainees provide an essential conduit for WA's required skills of the future. They are a source of skills, key skills in so many sectors, and without the flow of skilled and trained workers entering the labour market, skill shortages will inevitably develop. The number of apprentices and trainees in training from the December quarter 2015 to the December quarter 2017 declined by over 18%, a decline of 13% for apprentices and 23% for traineeships. Equally concerning is the number of commencements in apprenticeships and traineeships, which have declined over the last 3 years by 23%, 18% in apprenticeships and 25% in traineeships. The youth labour market of 15 to 24-year-olds has many dimensions. There are many who will not pursue a tertiary education, an apprenticeship or a traineeship, but they all require entry-level opportunities to the labour market. The concentration of entry-level opportunities remains predominantly in the award-reliant service sectors, particularly accommodation, food services and retail. These sectors are the sectors that have faced difficult trading conditions in the state over recent years and will no doubt continue to face in the year ahead. Considering labour market spare capacity, the underutilisation rate provides a measure of that spare capacity. In April 2018, WA's underemployment rate was 9.5%, up from 9.2% in March. In contrast, the national rate fell from 8.4 to 8.3%. Underemployment is now back to the level it was in July 17. WA's underutilisation rate is at 16% in April 2018, 2.1% higher than the national level. The 16% underutilisation rate is back to the level it was in April 2017. It is important to absorb the spare labour market capacity by creating more job opportunities for those who are unemployed, as well as increasing the availability of additional working hours and employment options for those who are currently employed. Reserve Bank Governor Philip Lowe has stated that it is important to have strong employment growth in order to start absorbing the spare capacity to get to the point at which wage growth starts to pick up.
Mr. Black?
Yes.
Has the link between increases to the minimum wage, modest increases to the minimum wage and unemployment queues been uncoupled by what the Fair Work Commission did last year, where they put the minimum wage up 3.3%, and in the biggest economies in Australia we've seen growth. So I don't ask you to comment on the West Australian situation just yet, because we may be different, but is the link between modest, now defined at 3.3, let's say, and unemployment queues, has that become uncoupled by what the Fair Work Commission did last year and the results following?
I don't believe it has sufficiently become uncoupled so as to say one relates to
It just
that.
seems to me there must be much bigger factors at play in terms of employment than the minimum wage and whatever signalling effect it has. If you can put up 3.3%, and presumably business were saying to the Fair Work Commission this will be disastrous, you're opening the floodgates to a big unemployment queue, and it never happened. I'm just wondering whether there's much bigger factors at play, and you might say those bigger factors are not at play in Western Australia because of the tenuous state of our economy. But there must be much bigger factors at play than the minimum wage.
And I would say, Commissioner, there are a lot of factors at play as well. So a rise in the minimum wage, for example, there might be an absorption effect where the company has been, or a range of companies or an industry has been tolerant for a while and absorbed, and the result of that minimum wage has not affected employment. It is just increased viability, shall we say. But in answer to your question, I don't believe there's been a sufficient decoupling to be able to...
Not on 1 year's evidence, let's say.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
The Governor of the Reserve Bank also said the most important component he emphasised is the growth in jobs. In February's Reserve Bank statement on monetary policy clearly noted that despite strong employment growth, spare capacity in the labour market continues to weigh on wage growth. With significantly high unemployment and underemployment, there's ongoing spare capacity in the WA labour market. And assisted by low inflation, that low wage growth is probably to be expected for a while yet. In the 2018-19 budget, the WA Government acknowledged that wages growth will remain subdued, consistent with those high levels of spare capacity. Creating jobs is essential. The budget has forecast an unemployment rate of 5.75 for 2017-18. So far this financial year, the average annual unemployment rate is at 6.05. In the 2 remaining months of this financial year, the unemployment rate would need to be in the order of 4.25% in order for that budget forecast to be realised. This would require an additional 25,000 jobs to be created. Additional jobs would then need to be added throughout 2018-19 in order to maintain the unemployment rate of 5.75% that is projected over the coming year.
Between now and the end of the year, there's to be 50,000 jobs just to meet the budget forecast. Additional jobs.
In the next 2 months, an additional 20,000 jobs would need to be created in order
Next
to
2 months.
Yes.
Thank you.
So the task ahead, Commissioner, is that we have a significant need to generate employment in order to meet those forecast targets of 5.75%.
And what is forecast? Is it 29,000 jobs in the next year is forecast by Treasury? Creation. That's my recollection of the number.
I don't know the precise number, unfortunately, Commissioner.
So your submission is that the budget estimate is unlikely to be hit in terms of the unemployment rate. This is a very significant increase in jobs in the next couple of months.
The next 2 months in order to reach the 5.75, but the 5.75 is also projected through the whole of next year, so we can roll that as an expectation over the course of the next 14 months.
It's not going to be hit when they say it's going to be hit, though, is what you're saying.
Well,
Unlikely.
I would hope that we materialise the confidence we've got and jobs are created. If we look at WA's participation rate, this has remained steady at 68.5 in April 2018, and the budget forecasts the participation rate in 2018-19 to be 68.4, so we are there. WA has the highest participation rate of all the states and the highest for males and females. In fact, in March 18 this year, the trend for female participation rate was the highest rate since the ABS Labour Force Data Survey began in 1978.
They're very industrious, aren't we?
We can be. The Reserve Bank Assistant Governor Lucy Ellis said in November last year that greater participation raises the level of living standards. Turning now to the wage price index, private sector wages growth in WA, as measured by the wage price index, has been weakening, as we've seen over the last 3 years, reaching its lowest level of 1% through March and June quarters last year. That has now increased through the second half of 2017, finishing the year at 1.5% in the December quarter, and in the March quarter moved up to 1.6%. The wage price index has been at or below 2% in WA since December 2014. The budget indicates an expectation for it to remain that way through 2018-19. The trends in wage movements in national enterprise bargaining. The Department of Jobs and Small Businesses Trends in Enterprise Bargaining report for the December quarter shows that for all private sector agreements, the average annualised wage increase for agreements approved in the December quarter was 2.3%. This is down from 3.5% in the December quarter of 2014. It is clearly demonstrating that restraint is being applied nationally. And this is particularly the case in WA, where the average annualised wage increase for agreements approved in the December quarter was 1.8%, a decline from 2.1% in September. Restraint is continuing to be shown by workplace participants. Employees acknowledge the significance of the current circumstances and the need for wage restraint. And this restraint is being applied for longer periods as the average term of agreements has increased to 3.2 years. As we have heard, WA remains the highest.
Mr Black, there are those who would suggest that enterprise bargaining is being stifled by a whole range of factors. There's issues of spare capacity. There's also issues of the complexity of the certification process under the Fair Work Act. But you would focus on the actual results of the bargaining as opposed to whether generally within the community there are pay rises, or is that something you've taken into account separately from the enterprise bargaining?
I'm referring to the enterprise bargaining as just an indicative process that's taking place in workplaces in WA.
Right.
There are extreme difficulties, as we all know, with the enterprise bargaining process.
Yes.
And organisations leaving that bargaining processes as well.
Yes. Yes. So the statistics, though, don't relate merely to enterprise bargaining, do they? The wage movement statistics relate to a range of considerations in normal pay rise negotiations between individuals and employers, or
those numbers in the report, the enterprise bargaining report, are the average annualised wage increase occurring over the term of the agreement as collated by the.
Yes.
That would be indicative of the agreed increases over the period.
Right. Thank you.
As we've heard, WA remains the highest of the states in terms of average ordinary time weekly earnings, exceed the national average by 11%, and that of the highest next state, New South Wales, by 10%. We have the highest average weekly ordinary time earnings for males and females of all states. And all this has occurred in an environment where the cost of living has been low. At 0.9% in the March quarter 2018, the Perth CPI continues to remain significantly lower than the national CPI of 1.9. And this has been the position that has existed for the last 10 quarters. Cost of living pressures have been lower in WA. Now I'd like to turn to talk about the small business community. While WA has faced its challenges as a whole, it's been particularly hardest for the cohort of small businesses covered by the state industrial relations system, principally sole traders, partnerships and trusts. Small businesses have been in a battle for over 4 years to manage in difficult times, and we would submit that we should not lose sight of who they actually are, small, unincorporated businesses. Small business owners have significant skin in the game. They carry significant levels of personal risk greater than other businesses. They bear that risk 7 days a week. Failure brings with it not just the closure of a business, but also, and very importantly, substantial personal costs for the individuals and their families. As a result, small business owners live with significantly and disproportionately more stress. They work long hours not only in the business itself, but also after hours. Their lot in life is a tough one, and they must be given a fighting chance to be able to recover and eventually also reap the rewards of the emerging confidence that's being shown at the moment. We must also remember that, like any individual, a small business can only pay for what it can afford, be that the level of inventory they carry, the range of stock on their shelves, the level of investment in new or replacement equipment, and the staff they can employ. This goes on top of normal operating costs, such as rent, insurances, utilities, repairs and maintenance, and so on. And we shouldn't forget that the owner also needs to get a salary for their own personal and family needs. Businesses, in turn, can only sell at the price for which they are there is a buyer. It is too simplistic to say that they can increase prices to cover costs. That is not always a viable option.
Well, it'd be crazy in the current CPI environment, wouldn't it?
Indeed. And they operate in a competitive market which determines pricing. Small businesses compete with the consumer's spending dollar. It's constantly being challenged not only by other local competition but by large national and international competitors entering the market that attract the consumer's dollars and exacerbate the pressure on small business. We note the news report from last Thursday that the local Sisters IGA in Joondalup, a family-owned business by Kate and Peter Brodie, is being forced to close its doors after 9.5 years, which the owners attribute to the discounting prices of larger competitors. And it is not as simple as saying that small businesses can absorb costs, reduce their margins or reduce their profits. Large businesses have significant advantages to that by the nature of their size, their purchasing power and their capacity to absorb cost increases. As noted in our submission, almost 60% of small businesses have a turnover of less than $200,000. This does not provide an awful lot of capacity to absorb costs, compress margins or reduce profits. We should not expect what is not possible. And we are sure that as members of this Commission and my colleagues at the table know of small businesses in their own local communities that have struggled or that have seen struggling, as well as businesses that have ceased to exist. There's clear everyday evidence of the practical realities that exist. One can simply walk down Piccadilly Arcade in the CBD, for example, and find at least 5 empty retail premises. Without doubt, there are many more examples throughout suburbs of Perth and WA's regions. There are, of course, businesses that can press on and are managing quite okay. Our business community is a mix of fortunes. But we say that there is a need to consider the whole, not the parts. We would draw the Commission's attention to page 10 of our submission in reply and to the data tables 1 and 2 that show business-related bankruptcies. This shows the continuing increase in WA's share of business-related bankruptcies. And we should take a moment to consider when examining these figures that they represent much more. Behind each number is a person and a family that has been affected. Just as we must grow employment opportunities, we can only do this with viable businesses to create them. The WA Treasurer stated on the 10th of May that the government, and I quote, is determined to support small businesses as we understand the important role they have in diversifying the economy and creating jobs, end quote. In conclusion, as we state in our submission, CCI supports responsible and sustainable wage growth through the state minimum wage and award minimum wages. In its determinations, the Commission must balance a range of statutory considerations for the state wage order, including to ensure a fair set of wages and conditions and to consider the capacity of employers as a whole to bear the costs of increases. As we have submitted, the notion of fairness must ultimately be born from 2 dual perspectives. From those who are the recipients of the wages and salaries, and from those who are required to fund the payment of wages and salary. We say this notion of fairness is of paramount importance. This must be considered particularly for small businesses that comprise 34% of the businesses in WA that employ between 1 and 19 employees. Small businesses are critical to the economy throughout the state, especially in providing valuable services and employment in regional areas. We should not ignore the impact of regional WA. There is a necessity to acknowledge the particular circumstances of small and micro unincorporated businesses that are the cohort covered by the state system who will be required to fund any award increases. So too is the need to increase access to paid employment opportunities, critical to reducing spare capacity in our labour market. We cannot close opportunities or discourage employment in any way. Caution and restraint in minimum wage setting is particularly important in WA at this time. CCI WA would urge the Commission in its deliberations to consider the specific circumstances of the economy as they currently are and in the near term. We say again that the confidence that's now emerging demands to be nurtured to fruition forecast to eventuate in 2019-20. We say that the need to ensure a fair system of wages and conditions clearly indicates that excessive increases should not be contemplated, and any increases must be sustainable for those required to fund them. Adjustments to the level of the state minimum wage and award wages must consider not just the effect of the increase in the statutory rates. Employment costs extend beyond the base award rates of pay, and any increase in the wage bill of a business also translates to an increase in the additional payments an employer is required to pay in terms of superannuation, workers' compensation premiums, leave liabilities, penalty rates and so on. In a labour market where significant spare capacity exists, the focus should not be to make any significant wage adjustments so as to result in a reduction in employment opportunities or available working hours. The Productivity Commission's assessment in its 2015 report into the workplace relations system was, and I quote, that modest increases in Australia's minimum wage are unlikely to affect employment, but that large increases in minimum wages would reduce employment. How and at what rate such rates manifest will vary depending on economic conditions and other policy settings, end quote. We submit that our recommended increase is responsible and appropriate in an environment where WA has a low cost of living, lower than the national CPI for the last 10 quarters, the highest average weekly ordinary time earnings by some 11%, high levels of unemployment and youth unemployment, and significant spare capacity in the market, in the labour market, with a 16% underutilisation rate. Further, WA's wage price index has exceeded CPI since 2014, and since 2011-12, increases in the state minimum wage and minimum award wages have increased at or above CPI. There has been real growth in disposable income. We would submit that our recommended increase continues to provide real growth in what will be a challenging year in the future. I'd like to just address the principles, if I may.
Thank you.
In our submissions, we have indicated that we do not see a need for a change of the principles at the moment. We acknowledge the ministerial review into the state's industrial relations system that has handed down its interim report, and we await its final report. Given the nature of the proposed changes contained within those recommendations, there's going to be a fundamental shift in the status quo, shall we say, of where we are now. It was our view that it was more appropriate to wait until the outcome of that review in which we would address these matters. The Minister, in his submission, has indicated that with respect to equal remuneration, that the proposal to work with the Section 50 parties to develop a principle, equal remuneration principle by consent, and we would suggest that's an appropriate way to move forward. Certainly by consent, we believe that we can get all the parties engaged on the same page to go the same direction. With respect to the other matters raised by the Minister with regards to the junior employees and the 40 versus 38 hours, probably this goes to the heart of one of the items in the ministerial review about the outdatedness or the fact that the state awards haven't been attended to for a while. We would see that, subject to knowing the extent of the problem, the number of awards that are affected, it's difficult to comment on who, how and where. But our view would be that we should deal with this through a separate process and...
Separate to the state wage case?
Indeed, yes. I think there is sufficient depth and interconnectedness and complexity that we should deal with it in an appropriate, effective and time-effective way.
I think it might be too rushed to deal with it in the next few weeks.
I would respectfully say that I think we need to do it right the first time round, not that we're going to do it wrong, but I think that due diligence says that we should take this process and understand its complexity. And from our point of view, representing small business, we would like to make sure that the impact of any changes are also well considered through that process. May it please the Commission.
Thank you, Mr. Blake.
I've got a question for you, Mr. Blake. You might have seen the Reserve Bank research discussion paper. I think Mr. Toomey brought it to the attention of all the parties. And that's obviously quite recent. That was just out, I think, last week. My understanding is that the paper makes several findings and in summary finds that award adjustments are passed on to wages, that there's no evidence award changes have an adverse effect on hours work or on job destruction rates. And I just wondered if you wanted to comment on that.
Yes, thanks, Commissioner.
Obviously that's in a national context, but I'm conscious as well that many, certainly for the period that this paper seems to deal with, there would have been other states for which, you know, small business was included in the effect of any national minimum wage order at that time.
The paper put out by Mr. Bishop is a personal view. It's collated over a period that was pre-GFC. It was collated over a period where we had high employment, we had the mining investment boom going on. As I understand it, in reading the paper, it only deals on a national context. It doesn't deal at state level. It was only collating.
But wouldn't there have been an impact, for example, in Victoria, which would have been part of that system at the time?
As I understand it, the report closes off before
I think
any movement took place on jurisdictional change with industrial relations coverage.
I don't think so. Doesn't it go until 2008?
Indeed it does, yes. I stand correct.
All right, sorry, I interrupted you. So you were saying pre-GFC and mining boom.
We had the mining investment boom going on at that time. And as he indicates at the back, there are some risks in terms of who he's assumed and who he has covered in terms of trainees, juniors, and the impacts that may have occurred at that level. So at the conclusion of his paper, he actually does provide some caveats to the context in which he's assembled it. But we would say that there's minimal attention should be paid given it's a substantial period of time ago, and we are in a completely different industrial context now and an economic context following the GFC.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Black.
Dr. Diamond.
Thank you. May it please the Commission in court session. The Union's WA position on increasing award and minimum wages relies on its initial submissions and submissions in reply to make its main points. Namely that we are making a claim to increase the statutory minimum wage by $50 a week or by 6.2%, whichever is greater. For our claim, this should mean that the lower award rates, as determined by the Metal Trades General Award, from C14 to C10 will be increased by $50, and it should mean that the higher rates, C9 and above, should be increased by 6.2%. So with that in mind, though, we would seek to make a few further points and obviously to answer the Commission's questions. Unions WA is, of course, contending that the Commission should make a substantial real wage increase for award-reliant workers. We would argue generally that workers in Western Australia have not got a fair share of WA's most recent strong economic growth, and that has been demonstrated for a number of years over various measures of economic inequality. And in our submission, we, of course, refer to the Gini coefficient, the persistently high gender pay gap in Western Australia, and also the proportion that the minimum wage takes up of average weekly ordinary time earnings. With that in mind, our general point is that the WA Industrial Relations Commission should not preside over minimum wage adjustments in the state minimum wage that result in either falling or a merely treading water minimum wage bites. So just as the Commission has led with maintaining a higher rate than the national minimum wage, so too it should take a lead in reversing the erosion of relative living standards for the low paid, and so maintain, in that score, a fair system of wages and conditions. We would argue that it also has the opportunity to take the lead in increasing aggregate demand in the WA economy and arresting both the drag on growth inequality that's causing our state and, of course, as we heard this morning from the Treasury witness, to assist in in our economic recovery. Now, as part of our submission, we quoted extensively from the Australian Council of Trade Unions submission in the national case, specifically regarding ILO conventions on wage fixing, that of course deal with consideration being given to two factors when considering minimum wages. That's the needs of workers in their families, taking into account the general level of wages in a country, costs of living, social security benefits and relative living standards, and also economic factors, including the requirements of economic development, levels of productivity and the desirability of attaining and maintaining a high level of employment. Now, both Unions WA and the ACTU go on to argue that social interests and economic interests need not be at odds with one another when it comes to the minimum wage. The growing body of empirical research studying the employment effects of minimum wages and new economic schools regarding the economic risks of inequality and other prominent schools of economic thought provide sound support for moving away from a position whereby deciding a fair and relevant minimum wage necessarily involves a contest between social versus economic considerations. And that moves towards a position where we regard an assessment as fundamentally being about a common good. And by the common good, we can certainly illustrate that by the Reserve Bank's many recent statements about the need for wage growth. This is not wage growth. They're not favouring wage growth simply for wage earners, but they're favouring wage growth for the good of the economy generally. And to that end, that's why the federal and state budgets have both forecast wage growth, once again, in order to ensure, in the recent words of the Reserve Bank Governor Philip Lowe, that sustained low wage growth diminishes the sense of shared prosperity that we have in Australia. Basically, low wage growth acts against the common good. Now, in the argument about how labour markets actually work, what the research and what empirical evidence definitely suggests is that wage growth does just not happen by itself. One of the things that Unions WA has sought to do is set out a situation that we'd feel describes more accurately how the labour market works, and that's what's called a monopsony labour market, in which one or a few firms will dominate the markets for goods and services and for labour. So, for example, the Chamber of Commerce and Industry, in its reply submission, paragraph 119, argues that it would be fanciful to consider that the sole trader operating in Wangara could wield such market power so as to set the price for employment, as would the two business partners who own the General Mechanics service business in Canning Vale, or the family operating as a trust running a local suburban coffee shop.
Hang on, 111 of the reply?
Paragraph 119.
19. Sorry, I misheard you.
However, this situation is precisely what you would expect in a monopsony labour market. The small employers do not raise wages even in situations of skills shortages in order to acquire additional workers, because they would have to raise wages for all their existing staff and operate in an environment in which their competitors are not required to raise wages. However, referring to the quote that we put in our initial submission from Professor Alan Kruger, where he says, "Without a minimum wage, the monopsonist employer operates with vacancies, unwilling to raise the wage it offers to hire additional workers because it would have to pay that higher wage to existing workers as well." Now, Unions WA contends that Australian and West Australian labour markets are combining improved business prospects with labour shortages and low wage growth. In our initial submissions, paragraphs 5.11 to 5.15, we make the argument that you can have a situation of rising business confidence, emerging skill shortages, yet slack in the labour market and low wage growth. And this is an environment in which a strong minimum wage rise is needed for wage growth. The increase proposed by Unions WA will serve the common good, both the social and economic requirements. In the words of Alan Kruger, employers will be able to fill their vacancies without having to worry about having to increase everybody else's wages because that was already required by the minimum wage.
Okay, so let me understand this, Dr. Diamond. Insofar as we may need to have regard to the capacity of employers as a whole to bear the costs of increased wages, salaries, allowances and other remuneration, as directed by section 50 A 3D, do you say that employers have capacity to pay a $50 a week wage increase to the minimum wage?
They should be able to pay a $50 a week increase to the minimum wage. I cannot obviously speak to each individual employer.
No, on a whole, though. You say the small business, because when we talk about the capacity of employers, I think we've got to recognise that it's mainly small business who our decision is going to affect, and especially in retail, accommodation, hospitality. Are you saying that whilst not all individual employers will have the capacity, on the whole, the economic circumstances are such that there is capacity to pay a $50 a week?
In a situation where most of the employers that we're talking about are operating in these sorts of discretionary spending type areas, in areas where there's accommodation and food services, hospitality, etc., etc. Clearly, we can see from the presentation from the Treasury witness earlier today that discretionary spending, spending on non-essentials is very, very low, and there's not a lot of spare capacity there. So the interests of employers, small employers, medium-sized employers, is in being able to pay an increase in wages is inseparable from the fact that the people to whom the wages are paid are able to go out and spend.
But that assumes they're going to spend in their sort of business.
It can. One of the reasons that we're assuming that is precisely because the level of discretionary spending is so low. There's obviously a lot of spare capacity, to use that term, spare capacity to actually spend in non-essential areas and to spend more in the discretionary areas of household consumption than there is now. And the shortfall is caused by a lack of wages and a lack of wage growth.
It also assumes that those individuals in receipt of that minimum wage increase will be perfect consumers rather than perhaps partial savers or do other things with that discretionary income.
Barley holidays.
It need not. For a start, what we're also assuming, we are assuming that we're talking about people who are where income earners at the lower end to begin with. We know that they have a stronger marginal propensity to consume. This is set out in some of the sections.
It's in Wacos's submission in detail, yes.
Yes. So that's what we're talking about. A similar argument, of course, is made for a increase to the New Start allowance. That's the same sort of argument that could be made for minimum wage workers as well. Certainly, with low income earners, people who are not currently in a position where they're getting very high wage increases or indeed any increases at all. And given the fact that the actually recorded levels of discretionary spending for households is so very, very low in Western Australia at the moment, we would argue that there is a substantial argument to say that sort of a substantial increase in the minimum wage will lift discretionary spending.
Thank you.
Did you associate yourself earlier with what the ACTU is saying to the Fair Work Commission? The ACTU is after a $50 a week increase.
That is correct, yes.
Before the Fair Work Commission.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, I don't know what the ACTU is saying, but presumably they are saying things are good for corporate Australia at the moment. Banks are making mega profits, mining companies are making good profits. All across the board, profits are up.
They would be saying something like that. In addition to
how can you associate yourself with the same
Because,
a real increase and raw increase, given the difference between our employers and the employers the ACTU is talking about?
because the aspect of the ACTU submission I'm associating myself with is their section on the stimulatory effects of a minimum wage increase. Certainly, if I could finish, certainly, depending on the size and reach of the state industrial relations commission, you can make the argument that the stimulatory effect would be smaller overall, particularly if it's in Western Australia as opposed to national. But the stimulatory effect is nevertheless, we would argue, real, and it doesn't depend on whether the minimum wage increase is necessarily coming from a big corporation or a medium or small size business.
I understand the argument at that level of theory, but what I said to you, I was careful in the crafting of the question, is presumably the ACTU is saying to the FERC Commission, business can afford it.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're making big profits.
And
we're being told here business can't afford it. Mm-hmm. A $50 a week increase, business can't afford it,
mm-hmm.
and you say, well, despite that, I've got an argument about the stimulatory effect of a wage increase. Mm-hmm. There must be a difference between your argument and the ACTU, given you cannot point to large corporate profits here of employers to make an argument they can clearly afford it.
Well, my argument doesn't necessarily rely on large corporate profits. And nor, for that matter, does the ACTU rely simply on the existence of large corporate profits. Yes, what we're having, if I direct you to part of our initial submission, where we deal with the wage cost issue.
Do I have here anywhere what the ACTU says about corporate profit?
Mm-hmm.
Because if the ACTU says something about corporate profit, therefore gives $50 a week,
mm-hmm.
and you can't point to small business profit, then there must be a decoupling between your $50 and their $50.
Well, no, I wouldn't actually agree with that.
Okay, tell me why I'm wrong.
Okay, for the point, I think the ACTU's argument does not solely rely on corporate profits.
Solely.
Yes.
Does it rely?
It does. I think you can make the argument about business costs and the growth of business costs that is independent on this or that particular profit rate. And one of the reasons I was referring to my initial submission, yep. Just to simply trying to find the relevant section here. So I'm talking about section 12. Page 25.
Yep, the capacity of employers as a whole to bear costs of increased wages.
Yes, indeed. So the point we were making about average earnings per hour in the national accounts, and indeed the earnings of the labour costs per hour being. I'm having a look here, but I'll just read this out perhaps for the purpose of that. So growth in average earnings per hour has been weaker than the wage price index over recent years, both in goods-related industries such as construction as well as in the household services sector. So within construction, this may reflect slowing demand for construction workers. Broader compositional changes in the labour market appear to be also weighing on average earnings in the national accounts. So essentially, employment growth has been strongest in those occupations with below average rates of pay. So our argument is that when you look at labour costs in those terms, average earnings and average earnings per hour, that is a demonstration that employers, as taken as a whole, are in a position to bear the costs of increased wages. Now, you can sort of move up and down the spectrum, if you like, between the larger employers and the smaller employers, but the argument can be... Yes, I appreciate the point you're making, but we would say that nevertheless you can consider the point that capacity to pay is not restricted to simply the smaller employer, not restricted to the larger employers, but the smaller employers also operate within that cost. And insofar as smaller employers might have particular pressures, part of their pressures as well is their inability to raise wages, particularly sort of on their own, responding to skills shortages, responding to the need to for people to travel long distances, to go and take up work, etc., etc., raising wages by themselves in the context where their competitors are not raising wages, which is why we argue that a step like the minimum wage, or a minimum wage increase that raises wages that are paid by businesses more broadly is a better way of doing this for employers, because they will then, everybody gets to raise their wages, there'll be the stimulatory effect, and also it will add to wage growth generally.
I just wish, I suppose, Dr. Diamond, that there be a recognition that there might be a difference between what the ACTU says to the Fair Work Commission and what the Unions WA might say to this commission. It might be, hey, for corporate Australia, $50 is worth a go. Well, we've got to recognise there's differences in Western Australia, and how about we aim for 40 or something like that? Because I think there's a real difference between what the ACTU is submitting in terms of the circumstances in which they're submitting it from what Unions WA is submitting to us in our circumstances. And I have not yet been convinced that your association with the ACTU is well-founded.
Okay. Well, our point would be, though, that in the context of higher award wages, that the amounts that Unions WA is requesting for an increase in the state minimum wage is nevertheless proportionally lower than what it does in the national wage. So for a $50 a week increase is in the WA context actually more modest than than the $50 a week in the national context. But if I might resume.
I've run out of steam.
Okay. Well, look, to basically conclude the point that I was making, the Unions WA argues that our arguments about increasing the minimum wage rates and award rates, plus of course thinking about the need to increase wage growth, do serve the balanced and equitable approach asked for by the Minister's submission. And to that extent, Unions WA also calls attention to, of course, the research paper that's been released by the Reserve Bank, and acknowledging, while of course it's not an RBA view as such, being a research paper, it's nevertheless worth considering as a specific Australian study, because there have been very few of those on the impact of the minimum wage. One that looks specifically through the system of wage setting through awards. And as Unions WA points out in its reply submission, not only did the report find strong evidence that award adjustments are passed on to wages, it also found no evidence that award changes between 1998 and 2008 have had an adverse effect on hours worked. Indeed, it found evidence that jobs with larger award wage rises had larger increases in hours and hours worked than jobs experiencing a smaller wage rise. And the research paper provides evidence for the most recent scholarship on the minimum wage, starting with what the author calls the seminal contribution of Card and Kruger in 1994, Minimum Wages and Employment, a case study of the fast food industry in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Namely that increases in the minimum wage could increase employment in a monopsony labour market. Now, being a research paper, the author naturally includes caveats, such as the results may not necessarily generalise to large, unanticipated changes in award wages. However, minimum wage increases in both the Australians and the West Australian system are far from unanticipated, at the same time every year. And As to whether the increase is large, I guess this is reiterating a point we just discussed, I take the opportunity to call attention to the structure of the increase proposed by Unions WA, which you can certainly see at paragraph 2.3 of our initial submission. The proposed increase of about $50 a week diminishes as a percentage of award rates from the C14 to the C10 level and becomes stable from the C10 period onwards. We would argue that this claim is essentially moderate, and that's demonstrated by the submissions from members of the public by Patricia Carmichael and those members of the public who did not want to be named. While Unions WA is not necessarily in agreement with the specifics of these submissions, they do indicate a general perception out there in the community that wages and wage growth are too low. As public submission number 2 points out, the minimum wage is too low by contemporary standards. And you can add that to the considerations in section 50A, the context of living standards generally prevailing in the community. And they echo in that sense the comment made by the Reserve Bank Governor about low wage growth diminishing Australia's shared sense of prosperity. These submissions demonstrate that there is concern and a desire out in the community for much stronger wage growth than we currently have, and the minimum wage should make its contribution to that growth. Turning to the submission by the WA Council of Social Services with WACOS, I don't wish to preempt the WACOS oral submission, so I'll restrict myself to pointing out what might be a piece of information that could be considered a canary in the coal mine, that is an early indication of wage growth, not just impacting, low wage growth I should say, not just impacting discretionary spending but also spending on essentials. Specifically, their information on residential electricity connections or disconnections, which saw a dramatic increase in 2016-17. So that was from 9,774 to 2015-16 to 15,935 in 2016-17. The situation is also reflected in the Cost of Living 2017 report provided by WACOS, which points out through its financial counselling data, which starts on their page 53, that those households who saw the financial counsellors with wages-only income have higher levels of debt than those with Centrelink-only income. And lower-income households faced with low wage growth may turn to payday loans and other fringe financial lending to help resolve many short-term financial problems, only to result in increasing levels of longer-term financial stress. So the findings of disconnection and debt go to the quality of life, and also the ability of households to spend and actually improve their lives. And to that extent, we refer once again to, and in this case we can refer to the Minister's Economic Outlook, Attachment A, which points to, once again, the modest expansions of household consumption. Only 1.3% in 2017, slightly lower than the 1.4% in 2016. Unions WA would propose that the social interests served by a minimum wage increase would also serve the broader economic interests of Western Australia. A substantial increase that serves to raise living standards rather than match living costs, just match living costs, and serve the goal of the increasing need for discretionary spending. And that takes us to the submission of the WA Hotels Association, Hotels and Hospitality Association, or the AHA, who are calling for an increase of 1% in the state minimum wage. Lifting discretionary spending of households would not be well served by this increase. It would be inadequate from the point of view of looking back to CPI in 2017-18 and looking forward to CPI in 2018-19. So that's plus 1% and plus 1.5% respectively. Not only would a simple 1% increase not contribute to improved living standards for employees as required to the Act, we would argue it would do the opposite. The AHA submission in their para 12 makes the argument that the vast majority of employers in the hospitality industry in Western Australia are not covered by the WA Industrial Relations System, and continue to enjoy not only lower minimum hourly rates, but the ongoing benefit of reduced penalty rates. The AHA seeks to make this out as a disadvantage for the state system hospitality employers. However, in terms of labour supply, it could just as easily be argued as an advantage, given that potential experienced staff will be looking favourably upon a relatively higher paying employer. At any rate, the AHA does not provide much evidence that the burden of being in the state industrial relations system is so great that employers have sought to restructure themselves out of it. Nor has there been really much evidence in other wage cases, previous wage cases, that this is how businesses have actually operated. The AHA has also argued that the decline in regional tourism spending in Western Australia has negatively affected hospitality businesses in regional areas. However, of course, the WACOS submission makes the point at their 3.4 that the cost of living in regional areas as well needs to be taken into account in minimum wage decisions. They show that the northern regional areas of WA can also face significantly higher costs, such as the cup of takeaway coffee, median rent of a house, litre of unleaded petrol, cinema international release movie, etc., etc. So certainly in terms of regional living costs in Western Australia, setting a minimum wage that takes account of those is certainly going to be important, once again, for lifting the levels of discretionary spending on which they rely. Looking at the submission by the Chamber of Commerce and Industry, the CCI. The Chamber, of course, has urged the WA Industrial Relations Commission to consider the state of the West Australian economy and the labour market, both at present and over a short-term period, and adopt a responsible and sustainable approach and award an increase in the state minimum wage and award wages of no more than 1.2%. Unions WA argues that the CCI claim would not meet the needs of the low paid or improve living standards. It is in arguing for this increase, this not very adequate increase in our view, the CCI cites a number of justifications. For example, the low cost of living in WA compared to other states. Both Unions WA and WACOS submissions have shown that living costs are not just a comparison between states, they are also a comparison between people living within Western Australia. Unions WA has, for example, cited increases in state taxes and charges for the recent state budget that can aggregate to an increase of about 4.8%, certainly larger than what the government, either the government or the CCI, are asking for in terms of a wage increase. And WACOS has pointed out aspects of low-income life, such as food and energy security. These are the issues that the WA Commission should pay attention to when considering living costs and the WA minimum wage. CCI has argued that WA has the highest average weekly ordinary time earnings. Indeed it does. And it manages to combine that with a diminishing relative positions for low-wage workers. That's why, going right back to Unions WA's initial submission, paragraph 6.2, where we have a table that points to the growing gap between the WA minimum wage and average weekly earnings. That is exactly what the WA Commission should consider when seeking to ensure that West Australians have a system of fair wages and conditions and fair wage standards generally. The claim is that WA has the highest state minimum wage compared to the rest of the country, but as the Minister has already pointed out, not all wage rates in the state industrial relations system are necessarily higher than those of the national system, particularly including in the hospitality industry. And in making assumptions that the employees in the state jurisdiction are at a financial disadvantage compared to their federal counterparts, it is often not the case, as wage cost differentials will often vary. Chamber of Commerce has also cited declining productivity in both labour and multi-factor productivity. I should say in previous wage cases, the CCI has tended to discount productivity within the state industrial relations system as being far too difficult to measure to be a reliable guide. It is also the case, as both Unions WA and the ACTU have argued in their respective wage increases, that productivity growth and wages growth have been decoupled for a long time in Western Australia. And to that end, I would like to table a chart from the ACTU's national wage case, which illustrates this point. It's page 34 in that submission. So I think I've got enough copies. I won't spend too much time on it, except to point out that as the descriptive paragraph says at page 72, in all cases, the labour productivity indexes have grown faster than wage measures. And even with a different starting date for the index, the results would be very similar. So there is an issue certainly between productivity and wage increases in Australia, but the issue is that productivity has been growing. Leaving aside what it may be doing in sort of particular quarters, it's overall been growing, but wages have not kept up, nor have workers, we would argue, got their fair share.
Is that measuring the productivity of workers or the productivity of the business?
This is you'll see that there's real unit. You'll see there are some real unit labour costs, GDP per hour worked, gross value added.
People are. I'm just making sure that it's taking into account that there's driverless haul packs up north and this kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. It's people. Is it the red line, for instance, will be people?
GDP per hour worked. Yes.
But gross domestic product would have a whole lot of robotic inputs.
Well, robotic inputs, but the robot can only do so much if there's no actual workers to operate it.
It's a thing that you got one person operating a few of them. Is the union movement, currently doing enough work on productivity to produce wage growth? It's very easy for 20 years when enterprise bargaining came in. You gave up an extra public holiday and you got 0.25%. Mm-hmm. Over time, all those kind of things got done. Is there work being done by the movement on increasing where labour can increase productivity to get wage increases?
The union movement would argue that union members have done plenty to increase productivity. Labour productivity has grown far, far more and far more consistently than multi-factor productivity and other elements to do with the productivity of capital.
Then how come at collective bargaining those arguments aren't made anymore?
Well, one of the issues with productivity bargaining is that essentially, for the most part, employers, be they government or in the private sector, haven't really known what productivity is, and they haven't really understood it. Most of the time, they think productivity is essentially an increase in hours worked. Most of the time, they really haven't had any kind of idea on how to measure productivity. For a few years, Telstra used to do productivity surveys of CEOs in Australia. And their results were very interesting because what they would tend to find is that ask CEOs, do you think productivity in your organisation is very important? Oh yes, definitely. So, do you measure productivity in your organisation? No. And really what you found was that productivity was sort of the ineffable in pursuit of the indefinable for most of the time. People talked about it a lot. If I had my time over again, I'd become a consultant who would talk a lot about productivity, but very few people had any idea on really how to measure it in a lot of sectors. If you look at it, if you go to an academic journal that wants to describe productivity for very simple students and all that sort of stuff, the common thing is the imaginary factory that produces widgets. So we can see we produce sort of 5 widgets an hour and then we produce 6 widgets an hour, and that's our increase in productivity. There's a reason why they do that. It's because a lot of the expanding areas in the service economy, it's extremely difficult to measure productivity. And as productivity became increasingly tied to wages growth, it was almost impossible to actually define what it was. The break between productivity and wages growth became almost inevitable. Now, I don't want to spend too much more time because I could go into a whole separate discussion about the rules
mine's
around
really a thought bubble that I ask you to take on board.
Yes.
I mean, in the public sector, for instance, this commission hasn't had unions coming down saying, don't worry about state wages policy because we've improved productivity by 5%. We just don't get those arguments anymore. And
Well, part of the issue is that there's often no agreed criteria for what constitutes a productivity increase.
you come here and you ask the arbitrator to work out what it is.
Dr. Diamond, can I divert you back to this figure 13 from the ACTU submission? I'm trying to work out how I should read this, and there's a couple of things that I note here and I'd welcome your comment on. The light blue dotted line, average weekly ordinary time earnings real index, the grey line of median full-time weekly earnings real index, real unit labour cost index, they've all been increased. National minimum wage real index, they've all been increasing, but real unit labour cost has declined. How do I read that? What does that mean? That all of those measures of pay have increased, but the measure of labour cost to the employer has declined? Is that what it means?
That is what it means. Well, real unit labour cost isn't necessarily the same as sort of wages as such.
I understand that.
Yeah,
yes.
it's more to do with how much per hour overall it's costing an employer.
Yes, but why would that decline?
I would argue that real unit labour costs, the reflection of real unit labour costs is certainly to do with technological changes. That's certainly the case. There's certainly the situation of changes in work practices that may very well have impacted on that. But it's also the case that sort of a context in which real wages have not in fact been growing in a terribly dramatic way.
So this is actually the reflection, what we've just been talking about is the reflection of increased productivity.
This might be that could be the reflection of increased productivity as well, but I would say that it's also the case that it's also reflecting that people have not been capturing the increased productivity through their pay and through their wages.
You see, that was the point I was trying to come to grips with, was that they have been in that the average weekly ordinary time earnings, median full-time weekly earnings, and national minimum wage have all increased, but national real unit labour cost has decreased. So I guess I'm trying to understand that other than that, they all demonstrate that for each unit of labour cost, there is an increased actual wage rate measured by any of those other measures. That's just, I guess, what I'm trying to come to grips with.
Well, perhaps if I could take it on notice, Commissioner,
Thank you.
to bring you perhaps a more detailed sort of breakdown of the meanings of those particular
That would be
sections.
helpful
I can
to
do
me.
that.
Or is the contention that implicit in your submission, Dr. Diamond, that the wage measures, that is a WATI, and the median full-time earnings, etc., ought correlate with the green productivity line?
That is what
In
I'm
other words, the
saying.
shortfall is where you're saying workers are missing out on the productivity investment.
That is correct.
And at the same time, business per unit labour costs have fallen or have remained at a low level.
Well,
Would that be one interpretation?
That would be one
what this means?
interpretation, and it would be and it would go to the general point about what sort of labour cost pressure businesses have been under.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, I'm trying to move through as quickly as I can. I'll just go back to perhaps a general point that that workers who are award reliant in Australia will lack bargaining power, and as a result, they're going to be behind when it comes to translating productivity growth into wages growth, which is why I would argue that there are increases in the minimum wage are necessary for ensuring that wage rises occur at all, particularly if they're going to be, as I say, linked to, in some way, to productivity. So moving along to declining working hours, record unemployment, record youth unemployment. Look, in our reply submission, Unions WA made the point similar to the Minister, that there are businesses that there are increases, in trend employment in all the states and territories, except for the Australian Capital Territory and Tasmania, with WA having had the third highest increase, and in seasonally adjusted terms, the second highest increase. Referring to the high levels of youth unemployment, the Minister's initial submission observes that young first-time entrants into the labour force, as are many apprentices and trainees, are particularly vulnerable to indirect competition for jobs. First of all, employers may indeed choose to utilise other older, more experienced unemployed retrenched people, and for whom some of the key trades may already be quite experienced. Youth vulnerability in the labour market and their lack of bargaining power is why increases to the minimum wage are important to ensure the quality of jobs that young people enter. The quality of those jobs is inseparable from the value those jobs provide to first-time employees, which is why regular wage rises are necessary. The disadvantage that young people experience in the labour market goes to the broader levels of economic activity and demand in the economy. Unions WA has made the case, obviously, for the stimulatory impacts of a minimum wage increase and for the positive impacts on the economy and employment generally. The increase in underemployment in WA and Australia is linked, we would argue, to a growing issue of non-standard, precarious or insecure work. So a better way of thinking about underemployment or underutilisation is working time insecurity. Not just fewer hours of work, but also irregular hours of work. So irregular or fragmented hours in industries such as retail, hospitality or health services. Sectors where employers have sought to enhance flexibility and reducing costs by reducing or removing restrictions on working time arrangements. Workers in these areas can experience multiple short shifts with short periods of non-pay and no-paid breaks. This is not an issue that will be addressed by keeping wages low, and it will be addressed rather by looking at the power of employees within the labour market. To that end, the significant spare capacity within the labour market, as we argued earlier, has combined with skills shortages that means that employers have not faced pressure to raise wages without general mandated increases. So one of those is, for example, the minimum wage increase. An increase to the minimum wage as proposed by the CCI would be inadequate. It would not meet the requirements of the Act and would not reconcile the social and economic needs of Western Australia. So to that end, the submission by the Minister, Unions WA welcomes the Minister's submission that would be an increase to the state minimum wage by more than the estimated CPI, namely an increase of $19.20 per week. To that end, Unions WA agrees with the Minister that granting a real wage increase to the low paid will improve their relative economic expectation in the community. However, the Minister's proposed increase to the state minimum wage is still too conservative, given the persistence of measures of inequality in Australia. For example, the Minister points out in their initial submission, paragraph 48, that regular increases to minimum and award wages can play an important role in helping reduce the gender pay inequality, particularly if the state wage order directly affects a larger proportion of female employees than male employees. The Minister also points out in their paragraph 74 that employees who are award-free have significantly fewer protections than those who are covered by an award, and many award-free employees are reliant on the minimum rates of pay determined under the Minimum Conditions of Employment Act. employees receiving a state minimum wage are unquestionably low paid, and they're granting the minister's proposed increase. Well, obviously we want more than that. The minister's point about where industrial agreements are made in the state system are well founded. Smaller unincorporated businesses and the hospitality and retail sector are more likely to be guided by state awards. And to this end, the minister points out that their proposed increase would improve the minimum wage bite, estimating sort of a increase from 40.7 to 41.8. However, Unions WA obviously argues in its initial submissions, paras 6.2 and 6.3, that the decline in the minimum wage bite over the last 10 years has been far greater than this and far greater than the redress proposed by the minister's increase. Given average weekly earnings are of course likely to be increasing in Western Australia, a larger increase will be necessary. Similarly, regarding a flat dollar adjustment, Unions WA submits that in the case that the WA retains a state award system with a series of award classifications, the WA Commission therefore has a responsibility to ensure that award relativities maintain their margin for skill, at the same time as addressing the needs of the low paid. We refer to the table set out in our initial submission, section 13, in which we show that the combined flat and percentage increase awarded from last year certainly broadly maintained relativities, but didn't fundamentally redress the compression, which we argue that our particular formulation, $50 a week, or by 6.2%, whichever is greater, would sort of balance the factors that the Commission needs to take into account. So with that in mind, while the WA government claim certainly accepts the need for an above average increase, the relative modesty of the claim, we argue, would not meet the needs of the low paid or contribute to improved living standards, and would also not address the broader issue of where the pay increases forecast in state and federal budgets would actually come from, given the need to lift discretionary spending by households in the WA economy. And with that, I'll try and conclude with a set about the statement of principles. I think the Minister has broadly set out the history of the principles and how we got to the point that where we are. Unions WA has made submissions to the Ministerial Review of the State Industrial Relations System, arguing, of course, that there should be equal remuneration provision in the WA Industrial Relations Act, and we would certainly support the WA Industrial Relations Commission developing an equal remuneration principle to be incorporated within the current state wage principles to assist parties in bringing or responding to applications. Insofar as it's open for the WA Commission to develop an equal remuneration principle by its own general order, we'd certainly be accepting of that. In terms of what it would look like, Unions WA, of course, has flagged that the Queensland equal remuneration principle would be an interesting one, would be a useful one to start with, and would certainly have similar wording to be incorporated into the WA principles. Further to the principles, Unions WA is certainly prepared to work with the other Section 50 parties on matters arising from Principle 8, the total minimum wage adjustments, and Principle 9, the minimum adult award wage. Specifically, we certainly have no issues with the deletion of Principles 8.1 and 8.2, and possibly 8.3. And certainly on the question of the minimum adult award wage, bearing in mind, of course, it's wanting to see the outcomes of specifics, we think it would be generally the steps that simplify and perhaps, I think the phrase goes, having a principle about the minimum award wage rather than the minimum adult award wage would better encapsulate that it addresses wage rates for juniors, apprentices, trainees and supported wage employees. Similarly, on the question of award updating generally, Unions WA has put to the review, and we can certainly put to the Commission, that the principal reason we would see for having a form of award updating would be to ensure that those award-free employees identified by the review, and we included the reviews list in our submission in reply, to make sure that they are covered by state awards, to make sure that they have award coverage. So our suggestion would be that a more targeted and cost-effective approach that certainly seems to be within the power of Section 40B for the Commission would be to adjust the scope and respondency clauses of existing awards to ensure that those people who are currently award-free are moved under the awards of their relevant sections. It seemed to us that this, if we're looking in terms of what should be a priority, what should be done sort of as soon as we can, what should be fixed, what we think is an immediate sort of issue, which is the award-free nature of certain classes of employees, this would be the most straightforward way of doing it that would be sort of the least resource intensive, if you like, for the parties. So on that point, that concludes the Unions WA presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Diamond. Now, Mr. Toomey, last but not least.
Thank you. If it pleases the Commission in court session, I'm speaking on behalf of the West Australian Council of Social Service. I'll give a very brief overview of the key points of our submission and respond to a few comments on the discussion today. I would like to start by acknowledging country, Kaya Nala Kadich Wajak Nunga Mor Kan Karak Nijabuja. As the peak body for the community services sector with a mission to support, assist and advocate for disadvantaged and vulnerable people, Lycos has sought to focus in our submission and our evidence to the Commission really on those areas where we felt our knowledge, experience and our on-the-ground networks could add value to the considerations around the minimum wage settings and how they impact on standards of living. So in doing this, we have avoided providing commentary on a pile of areas where we haven't felt that we've got the expertise or unique insights to contribute. Like, for instance, as CCI raised the issues around the capacity of different industries and sectors to pay additional wages. Except in very general terms and talking around the health of the WA economy, headline indicators, and what we've seen presented by the Minister in recent state and federal budgets. I would like to make some very brief comments on this issue around the capacity of small business to pay and small business risk, because I feel that we need to be thinking around it in terms of the balance between what is the wages pressure versus actually what is the buying power, what is happening within our economy that's actually contributing to the income of small business. And I would argue that what we've actually seen happen in Western Australia over the boom period, which has hung on beyond it, has been a hollowing out of our economy. So that we've had a growth in inequality, we've had an increase in spending power at the top end, which hasn't been translating back down into what we've been seeing in kind of local consumption. And you can see that coming through very clearly in both discretionary consumption and also in what's happening essentially. So I guess I would say that we need to be having some consideration to what is that stimulatory aspect within the economy, and perhaps also reflecting on Australia's experience through the global financial crisis around the focus and the success of the stimulus impact, which was particularly focused on pump priming the economy by focusing on the spending power of those on lower incomes. So I'd certainly say that that's an important issue to consider. So in particular, we've also focused on some of those areas where we could bring some insights and expertise. So that's gone around the data that we've got and feedback from frontline services, and then the work we've been doing on poverty, inequality and the cost of living. We have also provided some commentary on the sustainability and capacity to pay within our own sector. And I'd highlight a few key things in there. That we have a very highly gendered workforce. including a very high reliance on award wages. We're in the top 4 industries reliant on award wages, and that's at about 30% for us. And that also that the scale of employment in our sector is comparable to the agriculture and construction industries in WA. 58% of expenditure within our sector is on wages alone. That accounts for $6.7 billion into the WA economy. And it's interesting that 47% of the resource that goes into that is public funding, which also means that we play an important counter-cyclical role in balancing out the economy. We do also note that the health and social services sector is one of the fastest growing areas of employment, and particularly, as was mentioned earlier, demand around the Asian disability services area, with projections from the state, sorry, I've forgotten the name, but the projections basically suggesting a doubling or even tripling of employment in that sector over the next decade or so, and particularly Asian disability services driving that. But there are also some key viability challenges with our sector at the moment, and in particular we've seen some challenges of the gap between equal remuneration obligations and the lack of indexation and wage growth that's been happening within our sector, and this has particularly been biting on areas where you've got after-hours crisis and 24/7 services. And we have had a problem there in particular with a whole pile of these national partnership agreements which have been continually rolled over. So there hasn't been the opportunity to renegotiate contracts there, and we haven't seen any contribution from the state around those ERO obligations. So one of the things I guess that I'd particularly like to highlight is that we're also concerned within our sector and overall in terms of service users with the growth of insecure work, uncertain hours and precarious employment. And so on balance, taking that into consideration within our sector and within the people who rely on our services, we've come to the considered opinion that it is in the wider interests of our community and our economy to see a meaningful, moderate increase in the minimum wage. So we consider the stimulatory impact of increased spending power of those on lower incomes will benefit the community as a whole. And we remain concerned, as discussed earlier in questions, that without an increase to the minimum wage sufficiently ahead of those living costs, our domestic economy will continue to struggle. The economic and wage growth targets we've seen in state and federal budgets, we don't see what else is going to drive the ability to meet those. So we do not consider that an increase on the scale of $50 a week will have significant enough an impact to have a detrimental impact around hours work or jobs lost. We note in the RBA paper we've referred to the scale of increases over the period they're looking at were around 4%, whereas what we've been advocating is around 7%. I would also like to make some quick comments in terms of the CCI comments on this paper. I feel it's wrong to characterise it as the paper being presented as a personal view of the researcher. I mean, you can see very clearly it's branded and named as the Reserved Bank. It's clearly marked as a research discussion paper. Certainly that means it's not necessarily RBA policy, but it's very clearly indicated that they're putting their name onto it. So certainly it's not a personal view there. It also is covering a 10-year economic cycle, not simply just the boom period. So I feel that while there was a comment saying that it was a different IR context, that's not really relevant to the question of the relationship between the impact of the rising minimum wages and hours and job destruction. So I guess I'd just like to raise those points.
I think it's generally been accepted though, and we, I think, accepted last year that everybody seems to accept that a moderate increase in rates of pay in the minimum wage will not have a detrimental effect with respect to employment. The question still comes down to what's moderate.
Yeah, that's right, and it's a complicated question, and
it's a contextual one. Yes.
Anyone produce a very good answer around what's what's the formula, what's the modelling that gets you there. For us, that consideration of an increase of $50 per week is also linked to the advocacy we've been doing around rates of income support, advocating for a $75 a week increase. And it's also very particularly raised, as we've also heard from Unions WA, around that relativity and growing gap between average wages. And we certainly highlighted that in one of the graphs in our submission, where you can see that wages bite there of the minimum wage has dropped dramatically over the last decade. So we feel that it's important to be closing that gap, and that in doing so that will actually have a beneficial impact on the health of our domestic economy. So one of the things we very much focused around was the data and research from our cost of living report, which models 5 households. One of those is of particular great relevance, which is the typical working family. I would note that our working family model is the one that's most relevant to the minimum wage, but it's based on income that's above the minimum wage. It's got a full-time worker on minimum wage plus 33%, plus a partner who's working part-time with casual loading. So the numbers there are higher than simply if you were relying on the minimum wage. What it does highlight in particular is the impact of a couple of things, one of which is rental affordability. And while we've seen median rental declining in recent years, this is coming off a period of very high rises. It's come down now to $350 a week, but we note that still represents 49% of the minimum wage. And so if we have a rental stress marker that's defined as around 30%, you would say 49% is very much around extreme rental stress if you're just relying on that and you're in a minimum rental position. And we've highlighted the lack of availability of rental properties as seen in the Anglicare research in the Perth area that are affordable to people on the minimum wage. The numbers there are very low. The other thing that we've highlighted is the data around food stress and utility hardship, and particularly then, as Unions WA mentioned, the dramatic rise we've seen in electricity and gas disconnections over the last year, coming largely off the back of the increases in household fees and charges in the last state budget. We've seen that was 10.9% when it came to the fixed charge of electricity last year. We've just seen another 7% increase brought in the other week on the back of those. They're the household fees and charges overall are increasing at a rate much, much higher than CPI and much higher than what we've seen with WPI. So there is that increasing pressure. That does remind me that I also wanted to go, in talking about the cost of living, I wanted to respond to the Chamber of Commerce and Industry comments claiming that WA has a low cost of living and the lowest in the country, noting that they were referring specifically to CPI and making those comments. And our concern is that, as the ABS says, CPI is not a cost of living index and is not often considered actually to be a good measure of real living costs for real people, particularly those on the minimum wage. So, noting those inherent limitations, also noting some of the other types of data that's often pointed to, like the economic intelligence units, are cost of living measures where they're very much geared around what are the living costs for expatriate executives and employers to consider within Perth, which are very different to what are the living costs if you're looking at essential costs and you're on a very low income. So, and I think this is very much then highlighted, particularly I draw your attention to figures 11 and 12 in our submission, which are on pages 25 and 26. The first of those, and this is from the ABS data around financial stress indicators, demonstrates that those in financial stress are increasingly spending a much higher share on housing and utilities, and that's increasingly cutting into their discretionary spending. The second of these very much highlights the deterioration of the situations being experienced by any households with financial hardship and deprivation measures. And shows that the gap in their real expenditure compared to the rest of WA households has at least doubled in the last 12 years. So again, we're seeing this growing gap in inequality and this hollowing out that's been going on here. So, and in our data, one of the things that was highlighted were particularly around single people and sole parent households. And we do note that when it comes to sole parent families, they're one of the groups that has, for their reliance on income support measures, they have both the highest engagement with part-time work, but also the highest rates of bouncing in and out of insecure work. So, and they're also more likely to be reliant on award wages or the minimum wage.
Mr. Toomey?
Yeah.
You say in your paper that, your submission rather, that housing is the most pressing issue facing low-income individuals and households in Western Australia. And you talk about $350 being the median, taking up 49% of the state minimum wage. If that went up by $50, it would still take up 46%. It's going to be hard to get into home ownership off the minimum wage, even if the sort of increase you seek is granted. Am I being overly pessimistic in saying that when you make your submissions to us that we have to be simply realistic about what we can do about housing affordability, given our powers, and that the submission is more about making life easier generally without really thinking we can do anything about housing affordability?
Well, I'd certainly say when it comes to the affordability of housing, those policy settings aren't in your hands to the extent that there are those market pressures.
Much bigger issue than one we could tackle.
However, the mandate kind of issue that you have is around living standards and the affordability of people to be able to afford a basic standard of living. And so I guess, we're highlighting that the adequacy of the minimum wage against basic essential living costs has been deteriorating over time. And certainly the Commission can't solve that problem alone.
Impressively.
But also, we spend a lot of our time advocating at the state and federal level around affordable housing, particularly about affordable rental for people on lower incomes. And so we've had a very strong engagement, for instance, around making sure there are targets for that in the MetroNet development and that great link between affordable housing, transport and work options. So we've been doing those sort of things, but certainly when it comes to standards of living, the affordability of housing, then those essential household fees and charges, utility costs, and then the stuff around the cost of food are the kind of core things.
We can still help.
Yes, yeah. I suppose the other thing I'd point to is, in going through beforehand and talking about discretionary and non-discretionary spending, one of the things that we saw listed, for instance, in the Treasury graphs is that within non-discretionary spending, they list health expenditure. Whereas the data that we've got actually shows that for single-parent households, they're cutting health expenditure now because they no longer have the discretion. It's moved from becoming an essential thing to something they can no longer even afford. And so I guess that just kind of highlights more that there are these very real pressures. And I guess the issues are that the pressures are very much around those essential living costs, and they impact disproportionately on those on the lowest incomes. The other thing that I wanted to highlight there was the work that we've done around the financial counselling data, and this is the first time we've been able to do this sort of analysis, and I think it's the first time it's been done anywhere in Australia. Basically, what it's allowed us to do is having access to the household budgets that financial counsellors prepare for whoever comes to see them that's in financial hardship, and then being able to compare that to the general expenditure patterns from the ABS Household Expenditure Survey that came out last year. We can see very clearly what are the real kind of financial pressures that are most hitting those households that have led them to be in trouble. One of the things that very much stood out there was that it highlighted the housing costs for those on wages-only income and for those with mortgages. And what's interesting is there it was saying for those on wages-only income, they had much higher housing and health expenditure and were spending over 50% of their income on housing costs, which is a very high number.
So help me interpret those tables.
Yes.
Tell me what you're talking about.
So I was talking about in the second one, there's one that says wages only income.
Wages only.
Which figures that?
See that one there? So that should be saying,
Is this 12 and 13, or 11 and 12 figures?
hold on a sec. This is, sorry, I'm looking at the colour version, but I've only printed out the latest version in black and white.
Page 18 of your submission.
Yes, it should be. So basically, the top table is the ABS survey data, and the bottom table is the financial counselling data.
Okay.
So the ABS survey, it does give us a range of things. We've included there, for instance, mortgages and renters.
So it
because-
gives us a range of things which I don't yet understand, so I'm asking you to
yeah.
explain what each of them
Okay.
is. Yeah.
Yep, sure thing. So I guess I was highlighting two things there. One is that when it comes to wages only income, so this is very clearly people who are working
Okay.
and in financial hardship have come to a financial counsellor, they've got very high housing costs. And when you look at people that are saying mortgage only, they're up to 55%.
So 50.9% of persons on wages only.
No, so this is, they are spending 50.9% of their weekly budget of household expenditure
housing.
on housing costs.
Right. Now I've
This
got
is the percentage breakdown of their expenditure. And why this is particularly interesting is we saw this data last year. What we've heard more recently then has, and particularly that number for people with mortgages, that they're spending 55%. What's been interesting is we've now heard in recent weeks from the Banking Royal Commission reports about mortgage setting practices where they've been using the Henderson Poverty Line, or they've been using 10 to 15-year-old data around housing, around weekly living costs, or they've been leaving children out of their household budgets. So I guess what these two things together highlight for us is that there is a larger group out there, and we don't have the data to know how large they are, of people who are working, who are on what we might consider reasonable incomes, but are actually in severe financial stress simply because of the level of the mortgages that they're paying. So this is something that's just popped up on our radar, and we can't find out yet how wide or large this is.
We only lend someone money, so they have to spend 30% of their income on mortgages. But at the other end, you're finding there's people out there on 55.2%, or who are
Yes.
spending 55.2% of their income on mortgages.
And there's two possible scenarios there. One is the scenario where you've got someone whose circumstances have changed, so they've lost a job and taken a lower paying one, they've had their hours reduced or something like that. And so that's one thing that could contribute to it, or it could be that the housing costs themselves is what's driven them into financial hardship. And at the moment we're looking to in the future how we can learn more about that, so we can actually understand the numbers and the drivers. So I think I've covered all of those things well there. I did want to highlight some of those issues around inequality. So I did comment earlier on the gap between the minimum and median pay levels. So kind of currently being at around 40.7%, and that looking back, a decade or so ago it was around 71%. So there has been that dramatic change. Since 2005, AWOTI has increased by 71%, whereas the minimum wage has only gone up 46%. That's that growing gap. Sorry, I misread that. I suppose as well, in terms of that gap and the growth of inequality and that hollowing out that I was talking in the economy, one of the things that we've been very focused around has been our commitment around the UN Sustainable Development Goals around how you're closing that equality within the community. We've committed at a national level to growing the income of the bottom 40% of incomes faster than the rate of the rest of the economy. We can't see, other than increasing income support levels and increasing minimum award wage payments, how else that's actually going to happen. Because otherwise all of the drivers have been opening up that gap. So I guess I just wanted to highlight that, although I don't necessarily see that that's something that you're locked into. So the other issue I did want to highlight were those relating to underemployment, and particularly underemployment in gender as well, and the way that we've seen much higher rates of underemployment growth of casual, part-time, precarious work within WA as opposed to the rest of the Australian economy. We've seen an international trend about that, we've seen a strong national trend, but for some reason WA seems to have been even stronger in that. And I guess the reason why I wanted to highlight that is that it poses potentially an additional challenge to the Commission in terms of when it comes to considering minimum wage settings, are you merely focusing on the effectiveness of the minimum wage and award wages for someone in full-time work to maintain acceptable standard of living, or are you actually considering what are the conditions that are generally prevalent in our community and what responsibility do you have around those? I mean, that's a really tricky question. But the issue is if we're seeing more and more people who are bouncing in and out of work, have uncertain hours or are underemployed, then how does that relate to your responsibilities and commitments? I realise that's a difficult question. I think I have covered most of the things that I wanted to touch on. Oh, there was the question earlier around the equal remuneration principle, and this is certainly something that we've indicated and put in a submission saying that we very much support that principle. The challenge we've had around it is making sure that there is a matching commitment when it comes to state government funding to actually fund services to be able to pay that. But certainly, particularly as a sector where 3/4 or more of our workers are women, and also a sector where we still see that there is some wage gender disparity in there, these things are really important to us. So I guess in closing, we focus particularly on those issues around the health of our local economy and the importance of a stimulatory impact. And so we've said that what we believe is needed is a modest, meaningful increase in the state minimum wage to close some of those gaps that have emerged over the last decade or so. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Toomey. Is there anything further this afternoon? Otherwise, we will reconvene at relatively short notice as soon as the Fair Work Commission's decision has come down so that we can consider that matter. In the interim, Mr Entrekin, you're going to liaise with the Section 50 parties and see what you can agree ought to be done in respect of the statement of principles, and if you would get back to us as soon as possible. I suspect some of those things are not going to be able to be done, perhaps apart from the deletion of Principle 8, other than by separate applications of the Commission's own motion, but it would be helpful if you would advise us of those discussions. And Dr Diamond, did you still want to go ahead and provide us with some further interpretation of the figure 13 from the ACTU submission?
Since I provided it, yes, I certainly would.
All right, thank you for that. All right, other than that, I thank you for your submissions and we'll adjourn. Thank you.
All right. We're adjourned.
locked the